Our story in the Pacific really starts at the end of 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, why did the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor in the first place? They really don't want war with the US, so what are they doing? Well, you have to understand that the US is Japan's major source of steel and oil. They don't have any sort of major oil fields. They don't have a lot of productive iron deposits or the ability to make enough steel to do what they want to continue their efforts at conquest. So the United States has been selling them all of this steel and oil, but the United States is getting increasingly mad about Japan's conquests in Asia. So as Japan refuses to listen to the United States and continues to conquer left and right, the United States eventually has had enough, and then we say, okay, we're not going to sell you any more steel or oil. Now for Japan, this creates a problem. They have a stockpile of oil, but they will actually run out with the amount they're using to keep this war going. So they have a decision to make. Do we quit fighting the war? Do we just take what we've managed to take and then stop? Or do we find an area that has oil and conquer it? As it happens, there was one area very nearby that had what they wanted. And that area was the Dutch East Indies. But as an ally of the United States, and with all that was going on in Europe, it was not very likely that the United States was just going to sit by while the Japanese took the Dutch East Indies. In fact, it was very likely that that could touch off a war. So once the Japanese had decided that they were going to take the Dutch East Indies, then they had also decided that they were going to be at war with the US. Now the problem was, the US has a larger population, we are more productive, we have more factories, we have more resources. So if there was a long war against the United States, all of the Japanese planners agreed that the United States will win. So it had to be a short war if you're going to fight the US. And the best way to make it a short war, well, the Japanese had learned this years earlier. In fact, just before World War I, in the SINO-Japanese War, when they had surprise attacked Port Arthur and ultimately defeated the Russian Navy. So they're going to play a similar trick. They send a diplomat to Washington, D.C. That diplomat talks about ways that we can work things out. And as he's talking it out, on December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, right? The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, our major sea base in Hawaii. And in that attack, they sink much of the American Pacific Fleet. Now, fortunately for the US and unfortunately for Japan, our carrier fleet was out to sea. It was out on a mission and just coming back. So because none of our carriers were sunk, this is going to matter a lot later when we get to the Battle of Midway. So a few days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese hit Guam, and they also hit the Philippines. Fairly quickly, General MacArthur is forced to retreat from the Philippines, and at that point, in Asia, it looks like the Japanese are going to conquer everything. They're also moving on the Dutch East Indies, and they're also getting right up to the edges and setting up for what looks like an invasion of Australia. And back in Europe, the Germans have conquered almost all of Europe at that point. It's looking pretty grim for the Allies. But America is just getting started. So in 1942, the Japanese continue their conquests. Singapore falls to Japan in February. They take around 25,000 prisoners. But things are about to change. The Americans have cracked one of the key Japanese naval codes that they send messages back and forth across the sea. And so we're listening to their messages. They don't know it, but we're listening. Now, this is going to be really important because if we want to take out their carriers, which has turned out to be the most important part of fleet warfare, if we want to take out their carriers, we have to find them. And it turns out that the Japanese are planning a major attack on one more key American island. We just don't know which one. They keep referring to it as AF, but we don't know what that means. It could be any island. So we need a way to figure it out. an enterprising young man in the code-breaking office thinks he has a way to do it. And here's what he does. He has Midway Island, because he thinks it's Midway. He has Midway Island send out a message that they're running out of water. Then they listen. And sure enough, the Japanese come back in their coded messages and say that the island AF is low on water. That tells us that Midway is where they're planning to attack. From there, we set up our carriers and get them in the right position and surprise attack the Japanese as they're coming in to hit Midway. Now, it's a messy battle, and you can see much more of it in some of the other videos that I linked to in our assignments this week. But ultimately, the Americans are victorious and are able to defeat many of the Japanese carriers. And this is really a major turning point, because from here on out, the Americans will be on the offensive in the Pacific. Now, after Midway, there are going to be a number of other key battles throughout the Pacific to decide who's really going to rule the waves. But the Americans have to get close enough to Japan to actually threaten and invade it if they want to finally end the war. Now, how do you do this? Well, you can't just go straight to Japan. The Pacific is just too big. You can't refuel and supply your forces over that great distance. You need bases along the way. The problem is the Japanese have taken all these islands and they've entrenched. They have thousands of troops on all of these islands in bases ready to fight. And it turns out that the Japanese are willing to fight to the end. So there's a couple reasons for that. It's mainly a feature of Japanese culture. So remember that it wasn't that long ago that Japan was a medieval culture. And in that medieval culture, you had a very strong sense of honor. And honor was one of the most important things that a man had. Now, you could gain honor by successfully fulfilling your duties, whatever those happened to be. But you could lose honor by failing at those duties. And it was important that it's not just that you lose honor, but honor is something that you inherit that comes with your family name. And so if you destroy your honor, you destroy your family's honor. And your whole family will be treated as a dishonored group of people. So it was very important to the Japanese to maintain honor. Now that tradition was rooted in the samurai way, but had become a part of the new Japanese modern military. And so Japanese soldiers had a very strong sense of honor. Now, that's going to lead to two very disparate, very different things in the Pacific War. On the one hand, because the Japanese believe so strongly in honor and believe that you should never surrender, they're going to fight to the last, and they're going to be extremely brave in the way that they do it. On the other hand, it means that any Americans who surrender to them are dishonorable. On top of that, the Japanese government had told them that Americans torture, rape, and murder anyone that we capture. So if you add those two things together, whenever they got a hold of Americans, or really any prisoners, they did the same to the British and even worse to the Chinese, they're going to torture them, they're going to beat them, they're going to starve them, and they're going to work them to death. Some of the worst war crimes of the war are what the Japanese do to their prisoners of war and to Chinese cities that they conquer. Think rape of Nanking. So this sense of honor creates, on one hand, huge amounts of bravery, ultimately leading to the willingness, as the Japanese are losing the war, it leads to their willingness to do kamikaze attacks, divine wind attacks, where they fill their planes with as much oil and bombs as possible and ram them into the American ships, trying desperately to keep us away from Japan. And on the other hand, this honor is also the seed for some of the greatest cruelty of World War II. Because of this honor, every time the Americans try and take an island, the Japanese lose tons of people. And the Americans lose way more than they should, because the Japanese should surrender earlier and they just keep fighting. On top of that, what we discover is anytime we get to an island that has civilians, men, women, and children, that they would either charge us with whatever they have handy and attempt to attack, or we'll find a cliff and there are instances of women with their babies in their arms jumping off the cliff, committing suicide, because that is another way to regain your honor. What that does is it convinces the Americans that to actually take the island of Japan is going to lead to tens of millions of Japanese dead and millions of American dead. And so, in 1945, when Vice President Truman becomes president with the death of FDR, when one of his aides whispers to him, "Hey, we have this new thing, it's called an atom bomb. Let me tell you about it." That option makes one of the most controversial decisions in human history possible. Ultimately, President Truman will decide that it is better to drop a nuclear bomb on Japan and hopefully save both Japanese and American lives than it is to invade. Now, there are a lot of detractors who will say, well, we could have just surrounded the island and starved them out, but that probably would have led to mass deaths for civilians in Japan as well. There are others who say, well, why didn't we just try to make a deal where the Japanese got to keep the main island? And all of these are pieces of one of the biggest debates in history. But what isn't debated is what happens at ground zero. So the Americans only had a handful of nuclear bombs at this point. But the Japanese didn't know that. The Enola Gay, the aircraft that was tasked with dropping the first nuclear bomb in human history, set up its run over Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. Now, the bomb that was dropped was experimental. They'd done a few tests, but they weren't even sure exactly what would happen. Well, here's how it turned out. The bomb exploded thousands of feet above the ground, and at the point of explosion, temperatures reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. There were hurricane winds at 980 miles per hour. The energy released was about the same as 20,000 tons of TNT. 62,000 buildings were instantly destroyed. 70,000 people were vaporized. You could actually see, people who went back later could see shadows of people walking their dogs on the walls, all that was left of people who had been just turned into vapor from the high heats. By the end of 1945, 140,000 people were dead. At the end of the day, when all was said and done, 200,000. Still less than were killed in the carpet bombings across Europe, but massive numbers. After the first bomb was dropped, the Americans waited about 3 days. The Japanese did not respond. It was decided then that we needed to prove that we could do this more than once and keep doing it until they surrendered. So the Americans dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. Now, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were relatively small towns, not of major military importance, so why choose them? A big part of that had to do with the fact that you want the biggest scare factor that you can achieve because your goal is to scare the enemy into surrendering. And you also want to be able to see what has happened. You want to be able to see what the bombs actually do because the Americans aren't really sure exactly what will happen. So they chose two cities that they had actually not bombed before, so they were pristine, so they could, any damage that was done would have been done by these bombs, so they would know exactly. And the two cities were also small enough that the bombs would destroy almost the entire city. So in the blink of an eye, a whole city is gone. After the second bomb, finally, Japan surrenders. And with that, you have the end of World War II. Next time, we'll talk about the aftermath. What is the effect of all this?